Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with what I think is a really exciting video. I decided to do a video all about books I think you should read before you dive into Dante's Divine Comedy. And so as some of you might know, Dante's Divine Comedy is my favorite work of all time. It's a work of epic poetry that was written by Dante Alighieri in the early 1300s, and it is about a pilgrim with Dante's name. Essentially, Dante is a character in the poem, and he goes on a journey through the Christian hell, purgatory, and then into heaven. And along the way, he meets a lot of really interesting historical figures, mythical figures who he slots into different circles within hell, purgatory, and heaven. And so as you might can imagine, this is an extremely literary work in that it is constantly calling back to its influences. Dante was influenced by a wide variety of things, and you can see all of them in this great work of epic poetry. But let me preface this video by saying you absolutely do not need to have read any of the books that I'm going to talk about today in order to understand Dante. We live in the 21st century. Any edition that you're going to get, used or otherwise, is going to be fantastically annotated. So it's going to have a lot of great notes because perhaps of more value to you than any of these books that were some of his favorites would be to read kind of a history of the time period during which he lived, because he lived in an incredibly eventful time period that we don't often talk about nowadays. And so many people who were famous in Dante's own day make appearances in this poem, and you're often wondering who on earth they are. So any edition you have will definitely have a great note about anybody that he comes into contact with. But I really appreciate that Dante was a book nerd, that he was somebody who was constantly reading a lot, constantly making reference to other literary works in his own writing. And so I think it can be fun to play a little bit with those references and see which ones you've read, which ones you haven't. And one of my favorite aspects of reading classics is to pick up on allusions, pick up on allegories, pick up on references to other works that I might have read. And so I really enjoy doing that. So that's kind of the vein that this video is in. You may not be into that. If so, you can definitely just pick up Dante and go. I don't want to seem like I'm gatekeeping here. You can pick up Dante and read him tomorrow without having any of this background knowledge. And so I definitely encourage you to do so. But if you're like me and you get kind of geeky about this type of stuff, you might like reading some of the books that I'm going to recommend you today. One thing to keep in mind with Dante, and with the Divine Comedy in particular, is that he makes so many references that you can't possibly catch them all. And so what I decided to do was narrow down my list of books, because it could have been 25 books long. It honestly could have. And I'm just going to stick to the key few that I think are the main references, at least in the Inferno, which is the part of the Divine Comedy that most people read. I do encourage you to read all of the Divine Comedy because I think it's all quite beautiful. But the Inferno is the most famous for a reason. And so I'm going to kind of stick to recommendations that I think will help you better understand the Inferno in particular. I am getting ready to embark on a reread of the Divine Comedy. And so I am just kind of digging into this from all angles. I'm looking at different translations. So maybe I will do a video on different translations of Dante. So I'm really into Dante right now. My brain is in Dante mode. And so I thought this would be an interesting video to do while I am a little bit obsessed with Dante. And so some of these books are books that he read, absolutely, and are books that he explicitly references in the Divine Comedy. And others are a little bit more of kind of a subtle influence on him. The first I'm going to recommend is perhaps the most important, and is probably the one you're expecting me to say, because it is a religious poem. It is following the Christian afterlife. It is dealing with many figures from Christian belief, many saints, and so I can't do this video without mentioning the Bible. And I also don't want to say that you have to read the Bible in its entirety to understand Dante, because you don't. You absolutely do not. But you do kind of need a very good basis in Christianity and in certain famous segments from the history of Christianity, specifically events that happen and take place in the Bible, because they are extremely relevant not only to Inferno, but to the Divine Comedy as a whole. So I'm going to tell you a few books of the Bible that I think would be really valuable in helping you understand Dante and can be really fun to read alongside Dante. Of course, as you're reading the Divine Comedy, you will see specific references to different verses, and so that's fun to look up as well. But I would say in general, probably some of the most important books that you need to read are the Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Of the four, John is perhaps the most important. John strays almost into poetry, and so that was something that's really attractive to Dante. There's a lot of allegory in John. It's a really, really beautiful book of the Bible. It's also the book that most Christians will tell you is the best place to start in the Bible. I agree with that totally. I really like John. I think John's the most beautiful of the Gospels, but I think all four are of value when reading Dante. And of course, the Gospels are telling the life of Jesus. Also in the New Testament, I would say Acts is really important, the Acts of the Apostles, because several people who pop up there are important figures later on in the Divine Comedy. And so you will really enjoy that. I think Acts is one of the most interesting books of the Bible, and so it's one I highly recommend anyway, but I definitely think it will help you in your understanding and your reading of Dante. Perhaps one of the most famous books of the Bible are the Psalms, and I highly recommend that you read the Psalms. The Psalms are songs and poetry, so that has a lot of relevance to Dante stylistically. He makes a lot of references to the Psalms throughout the Divine Comedy. It's a book that you will find opened with you all the time when you're reading Dante, so that's one I recommend. The last book I would recommend is kind of a sleeper of the Bible. It's not a book that most people talk about, but it is one of my favorites, and that's the Song of Solomon. And in some Bibles, it's Song of Songs. And this is essentially love poetry that was written by King Solomon. It is in some ways very sensual, and so I think that's why it's not discussed more openly, but you will find, particularly within the Inferno and throughout the Divine Comedy, that the sin that is kind of the least egregious to Dante, let's say, is lust. Because to Dante, and in the Christian faith widely, he was right on this, love is the most important thing that a Christian can do. And so to Dante, lust is love taken to a darker place, taken to a point of obsession. So while it is a sin, it started out as something good to Dante. So Song of Solomon is something that he echoes a lot. You can tell that he definitely read that and referenced that quite a bit. That's one of my favorite books of the Bible. I think it is exquisite. I love the books of poetry. I think definitely so did Dante because they influenced him stylistically. That theme of love and lust is something that really colors the Divine Comedy as a whole. And so I think there's a lot of value in reading Song of Solomon alongside the Divine Comedy. This is a book that my professor, when I took a Dante course, suggested that we read alongside Dante, and I completely agree with him. I think it's a really interesting work on its own, and it's a book of the Bible I wish was discussed more. So that's the Bible. Obviously, you can read the Bible in its entirety. I would say Revelation is of major relevance to Dante as well. I would definitely also tell you Proverbs. I would tell you the epistles of St. Paul. All of them bear a lot of relevance to Dante and influence a lot of what he's writing about. So in general, you could just read the Bible to prepare yourself, but I think the books that I mentioned are a good place to start. Okay, sorry, the lighting's changed. It was getting dark. But the next thing that I would recommend to you is a piece of Dante's own writing that is not the Divine Comedy, and that is La Vida Nuova, or The New Life. And so this is a collection of poetry that Dante wrote and published around 1294, so long before the Divine Comedy. If you know anything about Dante at all, you probably know a little something about his muse Beatrice, or Beatrice as she is called in Italian. Beatrice is a really interesting figure. She looms very, very large in the Divine Comedy, and she is Dante's guide through heaven when he gets up into paradise. She is his heavenly guide, and that probably tells you what Dante thinks of Beatrice. He views her as very saintly, as very good, too good to be in this world for long. And so a lot of these poems deal with his kind of courtly love and attraction to Beatrice. And I think people often misconstrue the relationship between Dante and Beatrice. Think it was something physical, think it was a relationship that really was consummated, that they knew each other very well, and sadly they really did not. Actually, Dante was married. Do you ever hear anything about his wife? No. Some scholars argue that Beatrice didn't even know who Dante was. And so courtly love, if you are unfamiliar with this concept, is kind of writing love poetry to somebody, having an infatuation with someone that you never intend to act on. It is something that is very theoretical, let's say. And so that's really Dante's relationship to Beatrice. Some people don't even think Beatrice existed. They think she's a concept, but I believe she existed, and definitely other scholars do as well. And if she did exist, we do know kind of who she might have been. And unfortunately, Beatrice died very, very young. And so Dante went back and kind of edited this collection of poetry after her death and made a lot of commentary on it. This is a really wonderful, beautiful collection of poetry that I think can stand on its own, but it's definitely something that you should read in conjunction with the Divine Comedy. And a lot of editions of the Divine Comedy will often include it because it does so directly impact his writing of the Divine Comedy. Beatrice is a character who looms large in the first two books of the Divine Comedy, in Inferno and Purgatorio, and then she is a main character essentially of Paradiso, the last in the Divine Comedy. And so you can read these and get kind of a background for Dante's feelings for her, and you can also see how his writing grows. This is just a really wonderful source that I recommend on its own, but I do think it really complements the Divine Comedy because this also kind of experiments with Dante as a character in the poem. You're never quite sure if these poems are totally autobiographical because some instances make reference to things we know Dante didn't do. That's, of course, very similar to the Divine Comedy, where Dante, the pilgrim, is a character in the poem and is not necessarily always the author of the poem, if that makes sense. And so I think this is a really important work to read alongside the Divine Comedy. Another figure who looms very large in the Divine Comedy and is almost a main character is Virgil. Virgil is Dante's guide through Inferno and Purgatorio, and he leaves at the end of Purgatorio because he cannot enter Paradiso, and so it switches over to Beatrice being his guide in Paradiso. And so it's a really interesting thing. Virgil symbolizes quite a bit in the poem. Often people will argue that Virgil kind of symbolizes human reason. Beatrice often represents faith. So human reason, it can only take you so far. Eventually you have to give in and have a little faith. And so there's a lot of beautiful symbolism around Virgil and Beatrice in the poem, but Virgil was Dante's favorite writer. And I think that in general, the Divine Comedy begs you to read so many books. It really wants you to take a break every page and go find something new and read a new book, read a new verse in the Bible. But I think ultimately the Divine Comedy begs you to read the Aeneid. The Aeneid definitely was one of Dante's biggest influences, and I really also love the Aeneid. I think the Aeneid is one of my favorite works of the ancient world. I really like Virgil. I love the way he writes. And I think this is just a really wonderful epic poem. I think you can see how Dante's version of epic poetry kind of grew out of this classical tradition. And so the Aeneid is essentially telling the eventual foundation of Rome. It tells the story of Aeneas, who was fleeing Troy after the events of the Trojan War, and he eventually settles in the area that would become Rome. This is a very political poem. It had a propaganda element to it when he was writing it, and so there are aspects of this that are strange to read a little bit for a modern reader, but are also really thought-provoking from a historical context. I really think that Virgil's telling of the Trojan War is some of the most spectacular poetry we have. There is a female character in the Aeneid named Dido who is also spectacular. She's given a lot of great lines. Virgil has double meaning here. You want to read a little bit about Virgil himself, definitely, but you also want to read his writing because it was a direct influence on Dante. And as you get into the Divine Comedy, I'm sure you will find that Virgil is a standout character. Virgil might be your favorite character in the narrative because he's definitely mine. I think there's something really beautiful about the relationship between Dante and Virgil in the Divine Comedy, and that definitely comes from a place of admiration, from Dante as a poet to Virgil as a poet. I think if Dante were here today and you were to ask him to recommend you one book, this is the one that he would recommend. One of the most famous instances in Dante's Inferno is when he meets the four greatest poets, essentially, of all time to him. So these four poets are ones who also had a direct influence on his work, and I think it's fun to read them in conjunction with Dante. And so the first of those is probably one that you can guess, somebody that everybody views as a great poet, and that is Homer. The interesting thing about Homer for Dante is that at the time that Dante was living, nobody in Italy had been able to read or speak Greek, or ancient Greek anyway, in centuries. It's just not something that was happening, and it's something that wouldn't happen again until long after Dante's death, unfortunately. Basically, what he had in terms of Greek literature was poor translations of it. He read poor translations of Homer into Latin. And so most people think that's why he loved Virgil so much. He did have the ability to read Virgil in the original, and there's something to be said for that. But he had to read Homer specifically in apparently a very poor translation from the Middle Ages. He still recognized Homer's place in terms of the great writers, the great poets of the past, but that's probably why you won't see so many references to Greek writers in the Divine Comedy, is that he just really didn't have access to them. And when he did, it was apparently not the best translation. So that's definitely why you see more reference to Latin poets and poetry than Greek. Of the Iliad and the Odyssey, it is thought that Dante probably more readily had access to a translation of the Odyssey, and that perhaps maybe he didn't read the Iliad at all, which is a real shame. So I would recommend the Odyssey in terms of Homer. This is also one that you can just read in terms of seeing how epic poetry developed across time. And definitely there are shades of the Odyssey in particular to different parts of the Divine Comedy. Characters like Odysseus and Achilles make their appearances in the Inferno. So this is just really fun to read. Myth in general is a really large facet of the Divine Comedy. Myth and mythical characters are almost or just as important as the Christian elements in the Divine Comedy. And so reading something like this can tell you a lot about how epic poetry has changed, but it can also show you the original ideas that Dante kind of takes and transposes into his own work. He takes characters like Odysseus and Achilles and puts them in the Inferno. And so it's really interesting to see where they came from. The next of the four poets is Horace. I really like Horace. Horace is an ancient Roman poet, and his poetry is really, really wonderful. I think it's often argued that maybe Dante would not have read the Odes or the Epodes by Horace, which are some of his most famous works now, because a lot of them, sadly, were kind of lost during the period of Dante's life. That's another thing you'll notice. You'll often wonder, where are certain ancient works in Dante? Because it seems kind of pertinent that maybe he would have discussed Lucretius or made reference to some of the things that Lucretius was talking about as a philosopher. Lucretius was lost until the 1400s. And so Dante just plainly never had the opportunity to read him. And so sadly, that's the case with a lot of different ancient works for him. So I'm not quite sure if he ever read the Odes or the Epodes, or if he read more of the Ars Poetica, which is also really beautiful, but this is the edition of Horace that I have. Horace is somebody who's fallen off in the modern day. We don't often talk about Horace anymore. His poetry is really quite beautiful, and it's also a little bit funny. It's interesting, really, that Dante places him among the greats, because I don't think many people nowadays would place him among the greats of the ancient world, which is a sad thing to say. I kind of like Horace, but I think more people would maybe put Catullus in there or somebody else of the ancient world, but this is Dante's list of the greats. So you should definitely read some of Horace if you want to know why Dante placed him among the greats, placed him alongside people like Ovid and Homer, who really are spectacular. So if you have read Horace and also loved him, tell me your thoughts about him down below. The next of the four great poets is Lucan. And so Lucan was a very young man also in the early Roman Empire. He lived in the early ADs, and he only lived to around the age of 25. He was forced to commit suicide by the Emperor Nero because he conspired against Nero. And so his most famous work is this epic poem called The Civil War, or Pharsalia. It's often called Pharsalia, which is named after the most famous battle in the Civil War between Julius Caesar and Pompey. I have recently reread this, and I just love it. This is a weird one, and it's a hard sell because in many ways it doesn't really feel like poetry, and it also feels in some ways confused. Its tense is often off. Sometimes it's in present tense, sometimes it's in past tense, sometimes the characterization seems weird, and so a lot of people don't like this. In fact, some people don't think we should even call this poetry. There are a lot of scholars who just plain don't like Lucan. I do, and I wish there was more of him. He apparently wrote quite a bit that has not survived. I definitely think you can see his political leanings in this because this is an absolutely wretched portrayal of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar does not come off well here at all. You walk away from this really actually hating him, to a degree hating Pompey, and really appreciating Cato. And I really like Cato as a historical figure, so that's fine by me. Cato is almost a saint in this poem. He's just almost perfect, but he embodies everything that I think Lucan really was attracted to. Lucan was also related to Seneca, and Seneca also had some influence on Dante, so you might want to read some Seneca too. I definitely understand the criticisms against the Civil War because it is a weird one, but if you like epic poetry, I do think it's one that you should try. It's actually one of my favorite epic poems, which is a funny thing to say, as I love almost all epic poetry that I read, but I really like this one. His language is so beautiful. He really has a way with words when talking about killing, which is a really important facet of epic poetry in the ancient world, is to be able to talk about battles and bloodshed in a really poetic manner, and he definitely had that gift. So this is a work that's really interesting to be compared alongside the Divine Comedy because Lucan was definitely being punished for his political beliefs that were very, very clear throughout this poem. Dante, in a similar way, was exiled because of his political beliefs from the city of his soul, Florence. And so there are a lot of references in the Divine Comedy to people who wronged him. He places people who he absolutely hates, including the Pope. He places them in Inferno, in very, very funny circles for them to be in. And so you definitely see how Dante feels about people in his own lifetime. And you also see how Lucan feels about people in his own lifetime, specifically the Emperor Nero. And so these works very much complement one another. I definitely see why he discussed Lucan as one of the greats, if only because there is a real relationship between Civil War and the Divine Comedy. I really like the Civil War, but I have to say, I think this is the one on this list that most people would be most likely to DNF, and I completely understand it. But this is, again, Dante's list of the greats, and he definitely really liked Lucan. Last but not least of the four is the great Ovid. Ovid has a lot that survived, and all of it is absolutely wonderful. But I think the most important piece of Ovid's work to read alongside the Divine Comedy is the Metamorphoses, which is an epic poem that is retelling the most famous myths of Greek and Roman mythology. And often the references to myth that come in the Divine Comedy feel as though they're making reference to Ovid rather than to any Greek sources. And again, that harkens back to the fact that there was a dearth of Greek literature in Dante's age that was translated, and he certainly couldn't read Greek. And so you will definitely see a lot of references to Ovid in the Divine Comedy. Ovid's Metamorphoses is one of my favorite classics of the ancient world. In fact, it might be my favorite. I'm not quite sure between it and Virgil's Aeneid which one I prefer. I just absolutely adore this. And I think this is a really easy ancient classic to read because you often know what he's talking about when he's telling these stories, because Greek and Roman myth has so permeated pop culture that you know the names and you know some of the stories. And it's just interesting to read it in his really, really beautiful language. This also very much interacts with the Divine Comedy in an interesting way. It's structured in a similar way, and I think that there is a lot of benefit to reading it alongside the Divine Comedy. One of the last things I would recommend you read before the Divine Comedy or alongside it would be Augustine's Confessions. So this is a late Roman classic from the later Roman Empire that was written by St. Augustine, and it's all about his conversion to Christianity. And it's a really, really important piece of theological and Christian scholarship. It's still studied today by churches. It's still read widely. It's one of the most widely read ancient classics. It's really, really interesting because it is also very philosophical. It is interacting directly with things like Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle would be another one that I would recommend you could read before the Divine Comedy, because Dante did have access to some translations of Aristotle, and a lot of his philosophy is present in the Divine Comedy. But I think a religious scholar like St. Augustine will be of real value to you, because it definitely influenced how Dante wrote, kind of the allegory, the allusions that are present there, and definitely how he discusses kind of coming to religion and coming to a place of really wonderful faith, because the journey of the Divine Comedy is essentially kind of his journey into righteousness. And so I really think Confessions is a good one to read. You could also read City of God. I've heard a lot of people say City of God had a real influence on Dante. I have not yet read City of God because it is a brick, and I have heard that it is really dense and really hard to get through. But I think a lot of religious thinkers of the ancient world were really important to Dante. I think Augustine is probably the most famous and probably the most important to him. So I would definitely recommend St. Augustine's Confessions, but you could also read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. This was a religious text basically where he has a conversation with a personified version of religion or philosophy, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was a really important piece of literature in the Middle Ages. It was so widely read, and it was definitely an influence on Dante, specifically when he was writing La Vita Nuova. And so that's another one that I would recommend, and I would say you could read before the Divine Comedy. I've always been a little bit intimidated by Boethius, and so I've never read him to completion, but I definitely feel like I should. Speaking of religious thinkers, you might also want to read the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. It is hard to stress the popularity of St. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. It is hard to stress just how widely read he was. And so definitely Dante would have been familiar with him. And there are a lot of shades of his writing that you can feel in the Divine Comedy. And so I would definitely recommend that as well. Believe it or not, those are only a few of the books that I could have talked about in this video. And if you have sat through this very long video, thank you. You deserve a cookie. I hope that you enjoy reading the Divine Comedy if you haven't already. And if you have, I would love to hear your thoughts about it down below. If you have read any of these, please tell me your thoughts on them down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.